Hello everyone and welcome to this TouchDesigner Fundamentals video lecture. My name is JP Yepes and I'm going to be walking you through a few essential skills that you need to get started with TouchDesigner. Allow me to introduce myself. I am a creative technologist and engineering artist from Quito, Ecuador, but I'm currently pursuing a PhD in Wellington, New Zealand. A lot of what I do happens in TouchDesigner. This is a great framework because it allows you to do a ton of stuff with just a bit of knowledge, but you can really go far with it. And you can not only create some interesting visuals, but you can create interactive systems or some really interesting creative projects if you kind of have an idea of where you want to go. It's just a matter of getting comfortable with it. Just to show you a bit of what I've done, here's some generative art. The idea is taking advantage of what a computer can do to help you create some interesting visuals. And it doesn't take a lot. You just need to be willing to explore a bit of what TouchDesigner does at a texturing and coloring level. After that, there's plenty of stuff that you can do with computer graphics. There are some interesting textures and lighting, and you can really go far if you get an idea and you're willing to take it far, like to experiment with it. Additionally, TouchDesigner is great if you have a sensor or some type of input, which can be as simple as a computer mouse, or if you want to work with something more complicated, such as using data to drive your visuals. For example, let me show you something. And that's a bit of, you're basically mixing this whole creative graphics part of TouchDesigner. And in this case, I'm driving it with audio. So there's a lot you can do with it. To check out more of these examples, definitely you can see them on my webpage, or you can explore a lot in Instagram. There's a big TouchDesigner community that if you're really into this, they will not only be willing to answer questions, but help you explore this type of thing. And one final thing that I really enjoy doing in TouchDesigner is experimenting with some cutting edge technology. Machine learning is really popular right now, and here are a few ideas that I threw in, like just by throwing colors on screen and putting them through machine learning, you can come up with some crazy ideas like these little journeys that will take you through some images that a computer can imagine. You can come up with some unexpected textures, and TouchDesigner makes it really easy for you to explore this type of technology and for you to create your own material with it. So what we're gonna do today, might not go as far as these experiments that you just saw, but we're gonna get started and we're gonna try to get comfortable with the application. And then we're gonna try and move on to some more advanced examples. So let's just see how far we can go. The idea, we're gonna get started with some navigation and how to control and get used to TouchDesigner. Then we're gonna move on to our palette, which are simply a collection of our TouchDesigner objects. They go in a range of components and operators that we just have to connect together, and there's plenty that we can do with them. After that, we're gonna explore some creative examples in 2D and 3D, and we're gonna finally build a user interface in TouchDesigner just to see if we can control this and have fun with it to create an example that will allow us to interact with what's happening on our screens. Now, whenever we start with TouchDesigner, we're gonna be met with an empty project. The structure of TouchDesigner is quite simple. You're gonna have your work area. You have different bars that are gonna allow you to navigate through the project, and you're gonna have a timeline, which allows you to work with your project, but through time. So if there's anything you want to animate, you're gonna have this bar that moves across the screen, and you're gonna be able to track what you do in real time. Now, TouchDesigner has mostly containers that you can manipulate, and they hold all your objects and anything you might want to place in them. To navigate this, and I've prepared a small project with it. This is absolutely something I prepared previously, so don't mind it too much. But whenever you have a container, you can navigate to it by double clicking on it or by simply zooming in, probably with your mouse scrolling wheel, and you can see everything it holds. If you want to navigate out of it, you can just zoom out, or alternatively, you can just go up a level with the key U, or you can go in with the key I. So that's some essentials on navigation. If you want to move around your screen, you can you can translate everything by dragging your left mouse. You can select different elements by dragging your right mouse button. And again, you can keep scrolling in and out. That's a really comfortable thing. You don't have to settle for really small objects, or if there's something you can't do, you can simply zoom into things. Just being careful that if you zoom too much, you might go into them. So that's one thing to keep an eye on. This example that I've prepared is quite simple, and it looks like this. You can see a bit of a crazy texture on a simple sphere, and just some random noise to add some mood. We're not going to worry about this right now, but we're going to start to check out what we can integrate in our project. As you can see, TouchDesigner works by connecting different nodes. It's very similar to other languages. If you've ever worked with Pure Data or perhaps Max itself, Max MSP, it's the same idea. You connect different elements. It starts out with some data or an image, and you start to process it through different nodes, and you're gonna come up with different effects for it. You're gonna manipulate this. Now, in this case, I usually deactivate this viewer because this example happens to be a bit heavy if I have all these viewers working at once. But one of the main things that TouchDesigner does for you is making things really easy to visualize by allowing you to see them. All you have to do is click on this viewer flag, and you can see how your image is going so far. So if you have any problem, anything you need to debug, you can really track it, and you can find problems real easily. Additionally, you can bypass different elements. For example, check this out. This node is transforming my texture, and maybe I don't want it to do that anymore. I can just deactivate it by bypassing this node with the bypass flag. Or alternatively, if I don't want it to change, I can just lock it. I will not be able to manipulate this in any way. If I want, for example, to move certain things, I can definitely do that, but it's not going to allow me to do any big changes. When I unlock it, it goes back to it. It's gonna allow me to keep modifying this, and in this case, let's maybe do something crazy. Yeah, in this case, you can actually see the change. I'm locking it again, going back to 2, can't really see the changes. So it's something great. It's gonna ask me to actively confirm the unlock. So if there's something that you want to hold still there, or if you want to keep your nodes in a certain state, these tools are going to allow you to do that. So that's just a bit of working with these different nodes. Now, whenever we want to add different nodes, all you have to do is press Tab or double click on screen, and you're going to see our Create dialog. And the operator Create dialog contains all your components, which are the different elements that you have available to work with TouchDesigner. We have tops, chops, and SOPs, which are the operators that allow us to do different things in TouchDesigner. They're basically the stuff that we control. As you can see, the tops, which are purple, are all of our nodes that we have right here. We also have different materials to work with that we're going to explore later on, and that, which is anything that has to do with data and text, tables. So TouchDesigner is really flexible like that. You can see we have some components that are going to allow us to work with geometry, and we're going to keep exploring this later on. Some materials. And after that, we're going to be getting into some image processing. We're going to explore a bit of how to transform our images so we can come up with a finalized product, which is a lot like what we were seeing here. Whenever you right click on some node, you're going to get some options associated with that node. If you right click on the open area, you're going to get some more general options. To be honest, a lot of these I just use regular hotkeys like copying and pasting, but in this case, whatever you do with your right click is going to be more independently associated to the nodes, and those are the most useful ones, particularly view, which allows you to see your operator, whatever your operator is displaying in real time on a different window. And it's great if you want to compare different things, if you want to move through your project and see what's going on at different points. In this case, just we can see different stages and how the rendering process is going. So this is something great for TouchDesigner. We're gonna go a bit more into this whole, well, there are different words like rendering and compositing and all that we're gonna be reviewing later on. But what we care about right now is moving through the user interface of TouchDesigner. Again, if you want to go into different elements, we're going to go into this geometry and we find a different type of operator. Remember those SOPs that I was telling you about? SOPs, which are blue, have more to do with geometry and they're very useful for 3D. If we go into our, well, we don't really want to go into our camera, but you can explore different things such as cameras and lights, and they are what allow us to set up whole scenes for this type of example. So yeah, there's plenty to work with. There's a lot we can do, and we're gonna get into this. We're gonna be exploring this type of thing. Now, whenever you're working with your mouse and your keyboard, you definitely want to get used to this navigation. But at the same time, you also want to keep an eye on whatever it is that you have on screen. Some of the most useful things that you can have in TouchDesigner are the wiki, the forum, and tutorials. One of the best ideas that you can have in TouchDesigner is whenever you're working, just open the documentation. This is such a big language that it's really useful to just know what you want to do with it. And if there's anything that you don't quite understand, the documentation is going to be your best friend, really. So just that's the easy way to go to the documentation. But if you want to look up something that's more specific, say for example this mirror object, I don't quite understand what it does. Well, then maybe I want to ask for help. All you have to do is go to this panel, the help little button on top, or you can also have Python help if you're comfortable with Python or if you have some previous knowledge, and you're going to be able to find both the documentation of the object itself and the documentation in Python if you're comfortable enough to do this. This is not something that we're going to be checking today, but the next lecture is going to be a bit more advanced, and we are going to explore something more along the lines of Python and how to interact with these objects. So that's really great. TouchDesigner makes it really easy for you to know and to explore how to do new things if you're willing to read through it. Just a word of warning, this is such a big language that it's not a good idea to memorize everything you can do, every single command. Just use the documentation. It's the best advice I can give you. Now, whenever you need help with any of these objects, another really helpful part of it are the operator snippets. As you can see, not all the objects have them, but the main objects, such as noise, this is a very popular object, are going to allow you to see some very useful examples of how to interact or how to connect these different operators to come up with some creative examples. In this case, we have 5 examples associated to this object on its own, and they can be very different. These objects are very versatile, that you can do a lot with them just by connecting them together in your networks. So it's definitely worth exploring. Just if you have no idea of what to do with these objects, take some time and check out the different operators, the different examples, see what you can do with them. TouchDesigner itself is designed in a way that it's going to walk you through them, and you might just find some really interesting objects. You might find some examples that you might want to dig through. The cool thing about these examples is that you have absolutely everything that you need to work on them or to modify them and turn them into your own. So in fact, you could just copy and paste them instead. So that's one of the main things. These are some very useful ideas to get help. Remember, just through the documentation, which you can explore usually on this panel on the right, or by simply exploring the operator snippets. Now, you might find yourself in a situation in which you can't find this panel. The panel on the right, although it's open by default, you can hide it with the hotkey P. This is where you're gonna modify different objects, and you're gonna be changing all the options that you can change when it comes to each operator. We're gonna be digging through these a bit more deeply later on, but keep an eye on this. On top of that, the cool thing about TouchDesigner is that it allows you to go through different types of windows. It'll allow you to maybe activate a viewer on a screen layout. You can set up different pane layouts. If you want to do 2 things at the same time, this is really useful. Maybe you don't want the right one to be so big. You can manipulate it, and you can set up your workspace in a way that makes you really comfortable. Maybe you don't want 2, but you want 3 panes, and this is really useful because you can just go maybe into the network. You can have this checking out your main container, or you might want to keep an eye on something else that's happening inside your container. Maybe I want to go into my camera and see what's going on in there. So it makes it really easy. In fact, you can save this layout, and for example, I want to see this is gonna be my navigation 3 panes. I can just create my layout, and then as I'm exploring different layouts that I might want to work with, I can go back to it without too much effort. You can see that it's up here, and it will be saved with your project. Finally, and going back to our single pane, we're actually going to get rid of this project. I'm just going to delete it. If you want to delete something, well, you can just select it or directly click on it, and you can press delete. I just got rid of the whole project. If you did this by accident, you can always undo with Command Z, or you can, it's a good idea to keep saving your project, constantly save. And in fact, it's something I do as soon as I start, and I keep doing often. So just interesting things to keep doing. Another important thing that you might want to explore is the palette. The palette, which you can open just by, okay. The palette, which is something that you can open by simply clicking this button on the left side, contains quite the big amount of quite a large amount of different generators, image filters. These are also examples that you can use to learn on your own. For example, this checker. It's a very interesting way of coming up with this checkered pattern. And as you can see, we're just using tops, which are texture operators, to transform and manipulate this into a whole tile of black and white checkered pattern. We can just navigate up and get rid of it. One that's very popular. Remember that we were talking about noise, that was a very important operator. This is a different take on that. And if I select it and press P, or just open my pane, I can manipulate this. I can manipulate this operator and change it to different types of noise. We're going to talk about noise later on, but just these are very interesting patterns that are going to allow you to add some randomness and to add some interesting ideas to your project without too much effort. And the cool thing is that this is very customizable. If I go for something like maybe a cubist idea, you can play around with it, you can manipulate it as much as you want, and you can then just start to integrate it into your own networks. Some other cool ideas are just fractals, or you can come up with different image filters. In this case, like I believe there's like a blurring one. They're like, if you've played around with this is not far from Instagram filters, but you're gonna find a lot more interesting ones, and you're gonna be able to customize them yourself according to your needs. So definitely take your time to look into that, particularly if you are into technology such as Oculus or RealSense. If you've ever wanted to work with point clouds, this is where you wanna find examples. TD Ableton is great. This is a custom a custom operator, a custom container, which is gonna look for Ableton as soon as you open it. We're not gonna get into it, but there are plenty of resources online that will allow you to connect to it. We're gonna explore a bit of audio on the advanced lecture, but there's plenty that could help you just make this easy for yourself. And yeah, definitely explore this. One of the most important ones is going to be the UI menu on your palette, which it includes some basic widgets. Just by selecting the basic widgets menu, you can find buttons there. Remember that I was telling you that you can create user interfaces and just different layouts to control your whatever's on screen. Well, this is the way you do it. Like, you can have buttons, toggles, you can come up with floats, which is nothing more than an interface to introduce numbers. And you can create your own control systems, especially if you're working on some installation, or maybe something that you wanna have this exhibition where people are gonna go in and control stuff. Basic widgets are your friends. And just, TouchDesigner allows you to create your own objects if you want to, but there's no need to go ahead and reinvent this if it's already there for you. Definitely take advantage of these widgets, and we're going to explore a few other elements that are also part of our components. So we're going to go with that. And that's our introduction to the user interface. This is these are the main ways to interact with TouchDesigner. Definitely take your time to get used to it. Zoom in, zoom out, maybe create stuff, select it from your palette. As soon as you select it, all you have to do is place it, copy stuff, paste it all around, try to connect different elements, see what happens. As you can see, these are not working. Try to find out why that is. We're going to see why that is in a second, but this is how you get started with TouchDesigner. Don't just read the documentation, start doing something. And Now we're going to move on to some of our main operators. As we get used to TouchDesigner, it's important to start using and manipulating, connecting different operators together. And in order to really learn them, you have to see what they do. So it's time to experiment a little bit. And we're going to get started in the 2D realm. We're going to start with images and movies. So it's time to explore tops. Whenever I talk about a top or a texture operator, we're talking about anything that has to do with a visual asset in 2 dimensions. So you can think of images, or you can think of colors that I'm putting together, or different patterns that I can generate with the computer. So that's what a texture is going to be. The final output is going to be some sort of image or an animation, or we can use this final output as a texture to use in a more complicated system, which we will see later on. But let's start with a simple top. One of the most important ones is movie file in. Whenever we use a movie file in, although its name implies that we can use movies, it's the main operator to use images as well. I'm going to select my movie file in by clicking on it, and I'm going to click on its pane on this plus icon. That opens a browser that allows me to navigate all the default TouchDesigner assets. And you have anything from the default banana image to butterflies and to interesting larger assets such as this cloudy ocean, which is great for whenever you want to work with some sort of background and all. So make sure you check them out and see which ones you like. I happen to like this trillium quite a bit, so let's work with that one. Now, whenever we start with an operator and we want to connect it to a network, we're gonna add different operators, and there are different ways to connect them together. So find what's best for you. One of the most important operators, and funny enough, it's kind of a dull one. It's not nothing too exciting, but it's going to be very useful, is the null operator. As you can see, whenever you have this X, it means that something's wrong with the operator in your network. And what you have to do to see what's wrong is to middle click your button on top of this X icon, and you're gonna get some extra information. In general, whenever you middle click an operator, you're gonna be able to find some particular information on it. But in this case, we're looking for the error specifically, not enough sources specified. And what this tells me is that my operator is not connected. In this case, it's quite simple to see what's going on. But in other cases, particularly as you dig deeper into TouchDesigner, you're definitely going to want to keep an eye on these characteristics and any errors you might be getting. Now the null, which does absolutely nothing to our image, it's going to help us keep our project organized, particularly because you don't know how your network's going to end up as you keep working with it. So it's important to keep it organized, and that's exactly what null does. It basically is almost a checkpoint. As you keep moving, you might want to keep adding another null. The hotkeys Alt N or Option N if you're using a Mac, and you can keep adding nulls as needed. So it's a great way to keep adding operators. Then if you decide that you want to change things later on, you can just add them in the middle of it, and you can have some nice checkpoints in it. Now, to start throwing some operators that actually do something, let's right click on a cable, and we're going to insert an operator. We're going to go for a blur. And if you've ever done any sort of image processing, or if you've done something as simple as just using Instagram, you can see that blur is going to help us change our image a bit. You can have different types of blurs on your panel. So maybe let's go for Gaussian. And you can manipulate your blur a little bit by pre-shrinking your image. As you can see, it's getting blurry. You can change the filter size, and the effect is much more pronounced. And make sure to experiment with these parameters. I'm gonna go kind of wild with these sample steps. So let's go for something like 20 and 20. And as you can see, we have a parameter that's much more drastic. Maybe that's a bit too much with the pre-shrink. So I'm gonna get rid of it, and I get this almost diffuse glass type of effect, which I quite like. So let's use it like this. This is a good way to use our blur. So remember that you can keep inserting operators in the middle, but if you want to maybe branch out and find a different choice, go for add operator. Once you add the operator, you're going to be able to select something else, such as channel mix. Now the channel mix is nothing more than a channel mixer. And this is a good time to do a brief intro to color in TouchDesigner. Whenever you work, there are different characteristics in your image and all whenever you work in TouchDesigner. But one of the most important things to keep an eye on is how color goes along with your image. Your channel mixer just grabs your 4 channels of color from the image. We're gonna have reds, we're gonna have greens, and in here we have blues, although we can't quite see them. If I get rid of all of them, you can see that all I'm gonna get is a black image. Alpha is nothing more than the opacity, the transparency of your image, so I'm gonna ignore it for now. But the important thing is that if I add my reds, I'm gonna get all my reds from my images. However, you can see that this is a matrix. So these are all my red, this is what I'm getting on the red channel, but remember that this first column refers to that red channel as well. So what if I don't want my reds on my red channel and I want to turn them into greens? And this is interesting. I can just throw my colors around and get a different type of effect. If I want to preserve my blues, I'm just gonna go to my red, green, and blue column, and I'm gonna keep my blues right there. But what if instead of my reds, I want to bring those reds a bit into my blue as well? Maybe make sure you stay in the 0 to 1 range. So let's go for 0.5, and we get a nice effect of more of a cyan type of color. And then I'm just gonna maybe add a bit of green to this as well. That's too much. And that's an interesting way of manipulating your image. As you can see, I'm adding different effects. Now here's a problem. I can only connect one of these nodes to the null. So yeah, that's not really useful for this type of network. So maybe I'm gonna wanna have a way to select between these 2 nodes. And one of the most important switches for this to control the flow, and I'm just gonna insert it in the middle. As you can see, the null makes it really easy for me to keep selecting and adding these operators. Well, one of the most important ones is switch, which is right here. My switch operator allows me, unlike the null, it allows me to connect multiple operators to it. And what I can do is on its panel, I can select the different nodes that are connecting to it by simply selecting an index. You could blend between inputs, and you can get some interesting effects by mixing the different nodes that you're using. At this stage, I just want to use it as selector, so that's all I'm gonna do. And we're gonna go back to color in TouchDesigner later on. For now, let's move on to another one, which is level. If you want to find a particular operator, you can make it easier for you by just opening your double-clicking or tab and opening your create dialog, and then simply type the name. And it's gonna narrow it down to the relevant operator. So that's one useful way to select things. As you can see, it's not connected though, so I'm just gonna branch out again. If the operator looks like it has some, black bars around it, it's probably because of the size of this operator. You can resize it or just click on its corner and it'll auto size it for you. Now level is quite simple, but it's very useful. You can control brightness, you can control gamma, which is related to the color and how we encode it, and in turn you're going to see that it has a very important effect on how we perceive the colors on the screen, as well as the contrast. It's basically that's going to be the operator that we use for our processing and post-processing of our image. For example, if you want to change the opacity, whenever you change the opacity of something, you're gonna see that TouchDesigner starts to show this grayscale grid behind it. So that's, well, this happens to be very useful, just not right now. Again, we can keep controlling colors as well. Maybe I don't want as much red, or I want a lot of green. You can do that with this. The channel mix is much more useful for that type of thing, but level certainly allows you to manipulate something like that. In this case, maybe let's do something really bright and add a lot of contrast, and I have this very pronounced level. Sure, that does the job. And maybe I want to add another operator to it. I'm gonna add another level, and here's something fun that you can do with this as well. As you can see, level has a way to invert your image, and in a range between 0 to 1, I can just bring it up to max, and I'm going back between my original input and my final output, and that's level. And well, this one's useful for a network as well. And one last one that I'm gonna add is HSV adjust. HSV is nothing more than a different type to express color in TouchDesigner by using hue, saturation, and value. I recommend reading up on it if you're interested. We're not gonna use it that much right now. But the cool thing about HSV adjust is that it allows you to change the hues that you're using, and it's a very useful way to come up with different color mixes on your composition. Maybe I like something like this, yeah. And this one's already connected as well, so this is great. I have my network of tops. I can select via switch. Make sure you go to each one of these operators to experiment with them, and you're gonna be able to put together your own compositions. We're also gonna find different ways to combine these textures later on. But well, keep an eye on this, and we're gonna have an examples pack to explore, so keep an eye on that. That's pretty much the starting part for our first example. Now, there's as much as we have this switch, there's an interesting thing that I want to explore as well. For example, what if I want to use blur and level together, but right now I can only blend between the ones that are adjacent? There is an object that could potentially allow you to set up sub networks to start mixing and matching different things. Let's say I'm gonna select the ones I like the most. I'm gonna go for my channel mix, and well, I'm gonna just copy this. If you select everything with the right, well, with your right button, you can paste them down here. And I quite like this level 2, this inverted one. And I'm gonna paste it below. As you can see, the connection remains from the one above. I'm just gonna replace it by connecting these either to the input, or if you ever have to replace the specific connection, you can just drag it to the cable itself, which turns yellow, and you can connect this together. This brings me to another very useful top, which is gonna be cross. The cross top simply mixes and it blends the input. So this is great not only if you wanna put together two specific tops that might not even be together. Like I could just connect these ones and these ones to a cross down here, you know, and I'm gonna get the same effect. But right now, let's take a look at it separately. And what it does is that I have an index between 0 to 1 to control which one I want, 0 being the first input and 1 being the second input. Always keep an eye on what's the order of the operators that you're connecting them in your network, and that's going to be very important. Now you're going to be noticing that I'm only using like the first tab in each one of these panes. We're going to keep jumping into it, particularly because you're going to notice this common tab, which is going to be very well, it's going to help you a lot as you keep building your networks. Well, to wrap this one up, I like to add a null at the end of each one of my networks, and it's very useful to name to name nulls, or to name in general whatever you consider important, to keep track of it. So just end final. That happens to be my final output, and then I can just keep going through my crawls and mix it as whichever I want. That is that's a good way to start experimenting with tops. We just use an image. If you add a movie to it, it's gonna, the tops are gonna do the same, and they're gonna affect the color and the content of the movie in different ways. So keep an eye on that. Now, let's move on to something quite different, and I'm gonna get rid of all of these, and I'm gonna add another movie file in. Let's add a movie. I know that we have this count, and you can see that it's quite a simple movie. It's just doing its own. It's just looping from beginning to end, and it keeps doing its thing. Movie file in allows you to control how you play that movie. So you can lock it to your timeline, which means that it's gonna be doing its thing, and if you pay attention to it, I can rewind it and it's gonna go back to the beginning every time I rewind it. If I click on my timeline, I can bring my animation to whichever time I want it to be in, and it's gonna be reset. Well, at this point it happens to line up with almost the end of the animation, but it ends up being reset to the beginning as I do that. So that's one way to do that. You can do different types of crossfades or different loops with it. Definitely explore them. And you can trim your movies to only use a section of it. So that's pretty important. In this case, I don't want to do any of this. I'm just gonna reset all the parameters in my operator. So I'm gonna click on it, reset all parameters, and brings me back to the banana image, and I'm gonna add the movie again. So that gives me something to work. Having introduced movies and images, let's talk about something very important. Whenever you're working with your tops, it's very important to think about the resolution and basically the size of your image. So whenever you think of output resolution, you can use the input. In this case, there's no input, but if I add a null to it, this is an operator that will have an input. If you're ever working with an operator with an input, you can just keep the input from the previous one, and that's gonna avoid any unexpected changes in size, which can be a problem. Like if you're working on a beautiful 4K image or something like that, and eventually you get a random switch to 246 to 246 pixels, you're gonna see your image looking very blurry, or you're gonna see the quality go down. So you definitely want to keep an eye on that. If instead you want to set up a different resolution, you can select different options. In this case, custom resolution allows you to set up like something specific. As you can see, this is what I was talking about. Not only did it make it a square image, I could easily come up with something that's quite blurry. So let's just reset this one. You can right click on a parameter and reset the parameter itself. Let's set it to 100. And you can see that resetting the parameter by right clicking it only resets this parameter. I don't see the banana image again. It's just this one movie. And I'm gonna go back to use input, and I get the image at its default size of 640 to 360. Remember that we can get all important information by middle clicking on this operator. So yeah, that's one way to do it. But what if I want to change the dimensions of my image on the fly? And by dimensions and resolution, I mean just about anything we'd want to do. Let's start by cropping. So the crop operator allows me to select parts of my image by getting rid of either its left side or its right side. maybe a bit of the bottom, maybe a bit of the top. And you can think of this as the same way, 0 to 1, because I'm working with fraction. Whenever I find this type of selector on the right, and it says F, it's going to be anywhere from 0 to 1. 0 being nothing, 1 all the way to the right. In the right, 1 being all the way to the right, 0 brings me back all the way to the left. So this is a good way to resize the image and only select parts of it. You can do this at a pixel level. In this case, going from 0 to 1 is not going to do much because that's 1 pixel. But if I get rid of 100 pixels, I start to see how it changes my image. You can also do fraction aspect, which aspect ratio is nothing more than the ratio between your X, well, your horizontal resolution, and your Y, your vertical resolution, which we're gonna use later on, but for now we're just gonna stay with fraction. And we're gonna cut parts of it, and sure, this is totally random, but it works for us. Another one that's very important is fit. And this is great because if I have a different size of I don't know, if I want to mix an image with another one and they happen to be of a different resolution, I can use fit to change the resolution of my incoming movie file. I originally had the size of 642 and 360. By using fit and setting the common resolution to 1000 by 1000, I've changed the size of my image. And now here's the problem. This image happens to be longer on low, have more of a width than it does height. So it doesn't quite work for this resolution. I can select how it fits by doing, well, fit best. It happens to show all the image, but maybe I don't want that. So I could select to fit vertical, and it's cropping parts of it, it's cropping the sides of it, but at least it fills up the whole viewer. So that's an option. I could alternatively just set native resolution, and I'm getting the original resolution of the file in this much larger 1000 by 1000 image. So that's another way to do it. Find what works for you. I'm gonna leave it like this. And just so we can keep selecting our different operators, I'm gonna use my switch operator again, and I'm gonna keep connecting them to my network. Remember that this is my final null, which is great to keep track of how my network is evolving. Now here's an interesting thing. I'm getting different size of images according to which switch is selected. So definitely keep track of that. You don't want any surprises there. Another one that's interesting is flip. Flip happens to be one way to manipulate the textures, which you can either add a flip X and you flip it horizontally. You can do this vertically, or you can do a flip flop. Flip flop is basically a combination of a flip and you rotate. So in this case, you can see that I flipped the image horizontally and then rotates it as Y. Honestly, it's I don't know if this is particularly a popular way to do it. Whenever I use flip, I just use one axis or the other or both together. I don't often use this flop, but it's there if you want to use it. So we can connect it to this, and let's just flip X. Another one that I like to use is mirror. And mirror is an interesting one because, as its name implies, it reverses part of the image back onto itself. As you can see right now, I have my image very similar to the original one, and actually this might be a good time to bring the visualizers. My final image, or well, the source image, I'm gonna view it. I'm gonna right click it and view, and I have this visualizer that's gonna be handy here. So I'm gonna compare my mirror here, and I can see that the top part is quite the same, but the bottom part is just reflecting what the top part is. So that's what mirror does. And the important part is that I have a pivot that I'm going to rotate the image around. So maybe consider how mirror does its thing. If I rotate this 90 degrees, instead of having that vertical mirror, I'm going to have a horizontal mirror. And the cool thing is that I can change the pivots, well, the pivot point. I'm basically starting to pivot around to around here. Same deal, if I start to move it towards the right, I'm gonna see more of a mirror around here. Most useful one usually is 0.5 because I can just rotate either horizontally or vertically. So this one's ready, and let's throw it into my network. One that's worth talking about is resolution. Let's connect it, and you're gonna see that resolution, even though it has a high quality resize that sure you can use it if you need to, but in general, the reason why I want to talk about it, it's because resolution has it has a common tab which every other operator so far has. So if you ever want to do something with your resolution, sure, you could use this one. Just keep in mind that you have these options in pretty much every other tab. The only one that we've seen so far might be the null that you can't quite change because it always uses the input. But the resolution is it's kind of a redundant node. In any case, if you find it, it's there. So yeah, we could just use something like custom resolution. We're going to do 512 by 512. You can see that the input was this custom size that we had, and we're just turning it into 512 by 512. And we get this output. So that's going to be important to see. Keeping track on all the ones that we have. And that's most of the ones that we want to use for size. And now the one I'm going to introduce right now, the operator, might be one of the most important ones, which is the transform operator. Transform operator manipulates your image directly. So whenever you want to transform something, you can think of different operations such as translate, which moves your image 2 axes, left or right, or vertically, up or down. You can also rotate your image. You can see that like small increments don't really do much. Remember that whenever you perform rotations at a node level or with your components, you're talking about degrees. So unless you do something like a 90-degree rotation, you're not going to see much. 180 basically flips it. And while we have all these operations, one that's very useful is scaling. Whenever you scale, you're talking about changing the size of your image anywhere from, it's basically a multiplier. So if I want something like half its size, I'm going to use 0.5. If I want twice the size, I'm going to use 2. So it's sort of a percent, it's a fraction. Keep in mind of that scale. Maybe I want to do something just slightly smaller. So 0.8 gives me an image that's slightly smaller than the original one. And I'm preserving the size, but I'm scaling down the actual output of the image. And this is very important. Whenever you do grow and shrink is useful because it's similar to scale, but instead of using a fractional aspect, you're using pixels directly. As you can see, 100 pixels, 200 pixels, and it just does that for me, but I don't particularly need this right now. And this is one way to do it. You also have tiling. Like you can see that right now I've scaled down my image, but I have everything empty right now. This is important if you want to maybe put this over another image or something. But if you don't particularly need to do that, you can always set to repeat. And you can see that it tiles my image. You can also mirror it. And you can see that, what's happening there is that it's setting up different mirrors of the image around the original one. I kind of like repeat, so let's just set it to that. and let's connect my transform to my switch. You can see that switch allows us to just select the different outputs. You could potentially change the order of every single node that is connected to it. And you can see that the cable switch orders as well. But I don't particularly want to do that right now. So that's one of the main things about working with operators. Definitely keep an eye on the size of your operators and what you're doing with each one of them. If you ever run into your image getting too blurry, or your image getting a weird size of it, your texture just not doing what it's expected, like any random resolution, keep an eye on this, and maybe one of the operators you're using in its network is somehow changing the resolution. It's very important to keep an eye on. Now we're going to move on to talking a bit more about how TouchDesigner uses color for creative exploration. Well, I've prepared this network. As you can see, everything's pretty much familiar except for a few notes that I've put together. The constant top, this operator, which I can find right here, you can see that it has a darker color than all the other, well, than most of the other operators. That means it's a generator. It generates original content. It doesn't quite take an input. Some of them might for different options, but in general, it generates content. And you could use input to pass along data to it, but in general, you have a color coming out of it. Now, I've set up 3 different constants, and if you've ever heard of RGB, that's how computers usually work with color. In general, TouchDesigner uses this a lot. And the way we have 4 channels, which are red, green, blue, and alpha, which is the opacity again, but we're only going to worry about red, green, and blue right now. The way TouchDesigner works with color is by adding different colors together. And I'm going to be using this level and this comp, which is a compositing operator, which we're going to work with in a bit, but which is going to be adding our colors together. The way this works, I've turned down the brightness for each color, and you're going to see that as I add the color to it, I'm going to see more of it. And adding more of a different color starts to create a different mix at the end. You can see that I don't quite get any, like I lose the red and blue and I get something more purple pink. If I start to add green, I'm going to lean towards white. If I get rid of red, I can get something darker, and I'm going to see something closer to cyan, which is you're usually going to get through a mix of blue and green. So that's how colors work on their own. If I want to get rid of all of them, I'm going to go back to a black color. Again, the way to do this is if you select different operators and you manipulate a parameter that they have in common, you're going to be changing them, all of them at the same time. The best way to select a specific color through a constant is by grabbing the color parameter itself and doing color selection. The constant itself, and let's add a different one so I don't mess up with our network. Constant itself allows you to either grab different colors from this palette on the right. You're going to be able to add maybe some grayscale. You can grab, remember HSV that I mentioned before? You can grab the hue, the saturation, and the value of the color. HSV is definitely worth exploring. But if you're comfortable with RGB, you also had a bit of a red, green, and blue picker. As you get comfortable with colors, maybe consider using red, green, and blue. The more you work with TouchDesigner, hue, saturation, and value are a better way to work with colors and to do maybe some interesting effects and to mix similar colors without having to really calculate how green and blue go together. It's just way more natural. In general, that's how color works here. But we're gonna be adding something else as we go into this color. Like we have